Good evening. As you listen to the sound of my voice, you might begin to notice your breath deepening, slowing. Allow me to be your gentle guide tonight, effortlessly leading you through the peaceful landscapes of a time long past. A time that feels, at first glance, much simpler than our own. We are going to a place where the world was smaller, the sky felt closer, and the greatest anxieties were whispered, not shouted. It is a story about how ordinary people, just like you, react when the entire world seems to lose its mind. And as you begin to settle, just one gentle thought. If this space feels like a comfort to you, you might consider a soft tap on the like or subscribe button. But only if that thought feels as effortless as a quiet breath. As we travel back in time, I can't help but wonder where and when you are listening to this. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a quiet comment below, telling me your city and the time on your clock. It's a quiet way of knowing we are all here in this peaceful moment together. All right, let the shadows in your room grow long and soft. Maybe you can hear the faint sound of your own breathing, and together, let's allow the story to begin. You are waking up, but not to an alarm, not to the glow of a screen. You are waking up to the sound of a single, heavy bell. It's the bell of the town church, and it's your clock, your calendar, and your conscience, all rolled into one. Its first ring of the morning is the signal that God is watching, and it's time to get to work. Your bed is a simple straw-filled mattress on the floor of a small, timber-framed house. The air is cool and smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and faintly of the livestock that shares this town with you. You can hear your family stirring in the same room. Privacy isn't really a concept you understand. Life is a communal affair from birth to death. You pull on a simple woolen tunic, your bare feet cold on the wooden floorboards, and your day begins. Your world is small, and blessedly so. It's a tapestry woven from the faces you see every day. The baker, his hands permanently dusted with flour. The blacksmith, whose rhythmic hammering is the town's heartbeat. The weaver, the tanner, the woman who sells questionable-looking ale from a barrel outside her door. You know them all. You know who is feuding with whom, whose daughter is looking to marry, and who was a little too slow in paying their debts. This tight-knit world feels safe, predictable. The biggest news for weeks has been the argument between two farmers over a runaway pig. The greatest collective worry is the weather. Will there be enough rain for the spring planting? Will the summer be too dry? The price of grain is the subject of endless, serious discussion because it is, quite literally, the price of life. This is the silent hum of normalcy. The world turns as it always has, governed by the seasons and the saints' days. You don't think about time in minutes or hours. That's a strange merchant-like obsession. For you, time is marked by the position of the sun in the sky and the ringing of that church bell for prayer. Historians still puzzle over exactly how you would think about time itself, not as a line stretching forward, but as a repeating circle. Planting time, harvest time, the long, dark quiet of winter, and then the return of spring. Each year a slight variation on the last. It's a rhythm you can feel in your bones. Your diet is, let's just call it, consistent. You eat a thick, coarse bread, the kind you really have to chew, on a perpetual to-call pottage. It's a mix of whatever grains and vegetables are available, simmering over the fire day after day, with new ingredients added as old ones are eaten. It's not exciting, but it's warm. On a good day, there might be a little cheese or a piece of salted fish. Faith is not something you think about. It's something you breathe. The church isn't just a building you visit on Sunday. It is the center of your universe. Its stone walls are the most impressive thing you've ever seen. Its stained glass windows tell the stories of the Bible to people like you, who cannot read the words. The priest is your connection to God, the interpreter of a divine will that seems, for the most part, stable and understandable. You know the rules: be good, work hard, pray often, confess your sins, and you will be rewarded in the next life. This life is just a difficult, temporary test, a waiting room of sorts. And this simple contract with the Almighty feels solid, dependable. As you go about your chores, perhaps feeding the chickens, fetching water from the central well, or helping your father at his workbench, You feel a sense of security in this repetition. The world beyond your town feels like a myth. You hear stories, of course. Tales from the occasional traveler or pilgrim about sprawling cities, about the sea, about kings and their wars. But they feel like fairy tales, distant and unreal. Your reality is here, in the mud of the streets, the warmth of the hearth, and the familiar, comforting toll of that bell. There is a deep, unspoken belief that this is how things are, and how they will always be. The sun will rise, the seasons will turn, the bell will ring, and life, with all its small hardships and simple joys, will go on. That comfortable, predictable rhythm of your life, however, has one point of contact with the vast, unknown world, the market square. And one day a new sound joins the familiar haggling on laughter. It's a slightly different dialect, a sharper tone. It belongs to a small group of merchants, men who have come from much farther away than the usual wool traders or cattle drovers. They look different. Their faces odd, and by a sun you've never felt. Their clothes are of a finer cut, and their eyes are weary. They carry with them not just sacks of spices that smell like another world, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, but also story. At first you and your neighbors dismiss them. Travelers' tales are a common form of entertainment, full of fantastical beasts and faraway kingdoms. But these stories are different. They aren't spoken with bravado around a tavern fire. They are whispered, exchanged in hushed tones when the merchants think no one is listening too closely. You catch fragments as you pass by their stall. Words about a great pestilence, a sickness that comes from the east, from the lands of the Tartars, from the legendary empire of Cathay. They describe cities where the dead lie in the streets because there is no one left to bury them. They speak of a sickness that begins with a fever and a strange swelling in the groin or armpit, a sickness that blackens the skin and fills the body with a pain so immense it seems to defy God. They say it travels faster than any army, carried on the very ships that bring them their wealth. It moves along the great trade routes, the fabled Silk Road, a phantom passenger tucked away in the bolts of silk and the barrels of spice. The local priest tells you to pay it no mind. It is God's wrath upon the heathens in faraway lands, a punishment for their unbelief. It has nothing to do with you, here in your devout, orderly town. And you want to believe him. It's easier to believe him. The stories are too grotesque, too apocalyptic to be real. They feel like a dark fable, meant to scare children. But the stories keep coming. Each new caravan brings the same haunted look in the eyes of the men. They talk about the great port city of Cathay on the Black Sea. They tell a truly horrifying tale of how the besieging Tartar army, ravaged by the plague themselves, but for the infected bodies of their own dead. They flung them over the city walls, a gruesome biological warfare centuries ahead of its time. The story you hear is that the generous merchants inside, terrified, fled by sea, taking the sickness with them. It's a chillingly effective story, and while historians still debate whether this single event was the true ignition point for Europe's catastrophe, it's the version that spreads like wildfire from port to port, from market to market. It's the story that reaches you. You start to notice strange little things. These foreign merchants, they won't shake hands. They seem to flinch if you stand too close. One of them carries a small pouch of herbs, holding it to his nose whenever he has to deal with the townsfolk. A niche belief, even then, was that this pestilence was a miasma, a kind of poisonous air, and that strong, pleasant smells could ward it off. It's an idea that seems bizarre to you, but the fear that drives the man to do it is palpable. The whispers begin to change the texture of your town. The usual gossip about runaway pigs is replaced by hushed, fearful speculation. Could such a thing really happen? Could it travel all the way here? You look around at the familiar faces, at the solid stone of the church, at the predictable pattern of your life, and it seems impossible. This is your home. It is safe. Sickness is a part of life, of course. Fevers come and go, children are lost in winter. Old age takes its toll, but this thing they describe is not a sickness. It is a judgment, a flood of biblical proportions, only without the rain. One evening as the sun sets and the church bell calls everyone to evening prayer, you look east, out past the town walls and the familiar fields. For the first time in your life, the world beyond your home doesn't feel like a place of adventure and myth. It feels like a source of profound and encroaching darkness. The stories have done their work. They have planted a seed of fear, a tiny, cold knot in your stomach, and you have a terrible, sinking feeling that you are all living on borrowed time, waiting for a storm you cannot see but can now finally begin to hear in the wind. The storm does not break. There is no grand dramatic arrival. The plague doesn't march up to your town gates with a banner and a trumpet. It slips in silently, unnoticed, tucked into the humble belongings of a traveling friar or nestled in the fur of a rat on a grain cart. Its arrival is so quiet, you don't even know it's there until you hear that first specific cough. It comes from your neighbor's house, the Cooper's house. You've known him your whole life. A big, robust man with a laugh that echoed across the square. But the sound you hear from his window now is not a laugh. It's a dry, hacking cough, a sound that seems to tear at his lungs. His wife tells you it's just a chill, a common winter ailment. But a few days later, a different sound comes from the house, a wail of grief so sharp and sudden it cuts through the morning air. Then the cart comes, the death cart. It's a familiar sight in any medieval town, but usually, it makes its rounds slowly, perhaps once a week. Now, it seems to be in a hurry. You see the Cooper's body, wrapped in a simple shroud, being loaded onto the cart. There is no proper funeral procession. No solemn tolling of the church bell for his soul. Just a quiet, hurried removal. His family watches from the doorway, their faces masks of disbelief and a new kind of fear. Soon another cough starts. This time it's the baker's young apprentice. He complains of a sudden, intense fever and a terrible ache in his limbs. He says he feels as if he has been beaten. His master sends him to bed. The next day, his mother finds the telltale sign the merchants had whispered about, a hard, painful lump the size of a small apple in his armpit. It's a bobo, once foreign and exotic, is now spoken in terrified whispers. The boy is dead within 3 days. This is the moment the quiet fear in your town blossoms into full-blown panic. The thing from the stories is real. It is here. It is among you. The invisible enemy has breached your walls. And you begin to look at your neighbors differently. Yesterday's friend is today's potential source of contagion. A sneeze in the marketplace makes people recoil. A cough in church makes heads turn. The simple, communal trust that held your world together begins to fray, thread by thread. The town council, a group of stout merchants who are used to dealing with trade disputes and leaky roofs, has no idea what to do. They order the streets to be cleaned, a mostly futile gesture against an enemy they can't see. They consult the town's physician, an elderly man who relies on the ancient theories of the four humors. He proclaims the sickness is an imbalance of black bile and prescribes bleeding, purging, and the application of foul-smelling poultices. These remedies, of course, do nothing. In fact, the bleeding probably just weakens the sick and makes them more susceptible. It's a grim fact that the best medical minds of the era were utterly, tragically useless. Some historians even argue their interventions led to a higher mortality rate than simply doing nothing at all. You start to see doors marked with a crude red cross, a symbol of plague within. It's a warning to stay away. Whole families are sealed inside their homes, the healthy trucked with the sick, left to meet their fate together. Food is passed to them on long poles through the windows. The sounds from within these quarantined houses are harrowing, prayers turning to cries, cries turning to silence. The most terrifying thing is the speed. Someone can be healthy at sunrise and dead by sunset. This isn't a slow decline like old age or consumption. This is a violent, swift creeping. It defies all logic, all experience. It seems to pick its victims at random. The strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, the pious and the sinner, all fall before it. You see a family of 6 reduced to 1 in a matter of days. The social fabric is not just fraying, it is disintegrating. You find yourself engaging in strange, superstitious rituals. You hold flowers to your nose when you walk outside, hoping the scent will protect you. You start avoiding certain streets, convinced they are unlucky. You listen for the church bell, but now its tolling is constant, a near continuous funeral dirge for the endless stream of the dead. It's no longer a comfort, It's a terrifying reminder of the scale of the devastation. One of the most peculiar and heartbreaking details you notice is the animals. Dogs, cats, chickens, and pigs wander the streets, abandoned by their dead owners. Their familiar presence, now untethered from human life, adds a surreal, lonely quality to the town's atmosphere. They are living relics of a world that is vanishing before your very eyes. The silent arrival has become a deafening roar of death, and in the heart of that roar, you begin to feel a profound and terrifying loneliness. The rhythm of death settles into a relentless, terrifying new normalcy. Every morning, the first thing you do upon waking is a silent, fearful inventory. Are you still breathing? Do you feel the telltale aches? You check your family, looking for any sign of the fever, any hint of the swelling. The day is no longer marked by the sun or the church bell, but by the rumbling wheels of the death cart making its rounds. Its call becomes a grim refrain, bring out your dead. In this new world, faith itself begins to feel like a casualty. The priest, a man you once revered as God's own spokesman, seems as lost and powerless as everyone else. He recites the familiar prayers for the sick and dying, but the words feel hollow now. They bounce off the stone walls of the half-empty church and offer no comfort. He anoints the foreheads of the dying with holy oil, but the plague takes them anyway. He leads processions through the streets, holding aloft the holy relics of your town's patron saint, begging for divine intervention. You march with your neighbors, your voice hoarse from chanting, your heart a cold stone of dread. But the processions do nothing. If anything, historians now suggest, these mass public gatherings were perfect breeding grounds for the disease, accelerating the very catastrophe they were meant to avert. You start to hear a dangerous question whispered, a question that feels like a blasphemy even to think, has God abandoned you? Or worse, is he the one doing this? The priest preaches that this is a punishment for mankind's sins. Pride, greed, lust, vanity, the familiar list is trotted out. You look around at the faces of your suffering neighbors, at the grieving parents and orphan children, and you wonder, did the baker's apprentice die because of his pride? Was the cooper's sin so great he deserved to be struck down in a single day? The scale of the suffering seems to dwarf any sin you can imagine. It feels indiscriminate, senseless. It feels less like a targeted punishment and more like a blind, cosmic rape. The social order, once as solid as the church walls, is crumbling. Some people react with a desperate, frantic piety. They flock to the church, donating their life savings in the hope of buying God's favor, a spiritual insurance policy against the pestilence. Others go in the opposite direction. If the world is ending, if God is no longer in every sin imaginable, taverns that were once quiet are now filled with a wild, desperate revelry. People drink, gamble, and seize whatever fleeting pleasure they can, living as if each day is their last, because it very well might be. You see fortunes being squandered in a single night and lifelong reputations ruined in a drunken haze. The bonds of family and community, the very bedrock of your life, are shattered by fear. You hear stories of parents abandoning their sick children, of husbands leaving their dying wives. People are terrified of contact, of the very breath of another human being. The simple, kind act of offering a cup of water to a sick neighbor now feels like a death sentence. You start to feel profoundly, utterly, a world of shared lives and mutual obligations has been replaced by a world of isolated individuals, each locked in a private struggle for survival. A strange and specific bit of folklore begins to circulate. People start carrying what they call plague amulets. These aren't holy relics blessed by a priest, but strange concoctions of arsenic, dried toad, and exotic herbs wrapped in a small pouch and worn around the neck. The belief, born of sheer desperation, is that these toxic materials will somehow ward off the poison in the air. It's a desperate grasp for control in a world where all control has been lost. As the weeks turn into a month, and the month into two, a deep, pervasive silence settles over your town. It's the silence of emptied houses, of workshops with no workers, of a marketplace with no merchants. The weaver's loom is still. The only sounds are the weeping of the bereaved, the rumble of the cart, and the constant, mournful tolling of the bell. You look up at the crucifix in the church, at the serene, suffering face of Christ, and you feel nothing. The prayers have dried up in your throat. The familiar rituals have lost their meaning. It is in this profound spiritual vacuum, this place where God seems to be deaf, blind, and silent, that the conditions become perfect for a new, terrifying, and radical kind of faith to be born. You don't know it yet, but you are about to hear a new sound, and it will not be the sound of a bell. One afternoon, when the silence of the town feels heavier than ever, you hear it. It's a sound that doesn't belong. It's not the weeping or the bell. It's a low rhythmic chanting, faint at first, coming from the road beyond the town gates. It grows steadily louder, a mournful, hypnotic drone of male voices singing in Latin. You and the other survivors, the hollow-eyed ghosts of your former neighbors, slowly emerge from your homes, drawn by grim curiosity. Who would be traveling now? Who would willingly walk into a dying town? You gather at the main gate, a small, fearful crowd, and then you see them. It is a procession, but unlike any religious procession you have ever witnessed. There are perhaps 30 or 40 of them, walking two by two in a long, solemn line. They are all men, clad in simple dark robes, their heads bowed, their faces hidden by the deep shadows of heavy hoods. They move with a strange, deliberate slowness, their bare feet slapping against the dusty road. Two men at the front carry a large wooden cross and tattered banners painted with scenes of the crucifixion. As they draw closer, you see that their robes are open at the back, exposing their torsos from the waist up. And their backs are a horrifying tapestry of red and purple. Raw, crisscrossed wounds, some fresh and bleeding, others scabbed over from previous rituals. Each man holds in his right hand a terrifying instrument. A whip, a scourge made of 3 leather thongs, and at the end of each thong, a small sharp piece of metal is tied, shaped like a tiny star or a cross. They do not look at you. Their eyes are fixed on the ground ahead, their faces set in masks of grim determination. The chanting continues, a repetitive, sorrowful hymn. And then, as they enter the main square, the procession stops. The chanting ceases. A profound, tense silence falls. A man who appears to be their leader, their master, steps forward. He says nothing. He simply raises his hand, and as if on cue, the men arrange themselves into a large circle. Then, the real ritual begins. At another signal from the master, the men all drop to their knees. The master begins to speak, his voice ringing out in the empty square, reciting a litany of sins. Pride, lust, greed, heresy. With each sin he names, the men prostrate themselves, lying face down in the dirt, their arms outstretched in the shape of a cross. They lie there, motionless, a circle of fallen figures. You watch, frozen, a mixture of horror and fascination churning in your gut. This isn't prayer as you know it. This is something else entirely. Something primal, theatrical, and deeply unsettling. The master gives a third signal. The men rise to their feet, and then the whipping begins. They start to circle slowly, and with each step they swing the heavy leather scourges over their shoulders, bringing them down hard onto their own backs. The sound is what gets you. A sickening, wet whack, over and over and over. It's the sound of leather and metal biting into flesh. It echoes off the walls of the surrounding houses, the brutal percussion accompanying their renewed, now more frantic chanting. Blood begins to fly. It splatters onto the cobblestones, onto the robes of the men in front of them. Some of them cry out, not in what sounds like pain, but in a strange, ecstatic fervor. Their voices rise in pitch, their movements become more frenzied. You see grown men, bearded and strong, weeping openly as they flog themselves, their faces a bizarre mixture of agony and rapture. You've never seen anything like it. This public display of self-mortification is a world away from the quiet, private confession you practice with your priest. The sheer theatricality of it is stunning. Some of your neighbors shrink back in horror, pulling their children close, but others watch with a rapt, almost hopeful expression. In a world where prayers have failed and priests have no answers, here is a group of men taking action. They are not passively waiting for God's judgment. They are meeting it head-on with their own flesh and blood. It is a terrifying, mesmerizing, and strangely compelling spectacle. You are witnessing your first encounter with the Brothers of the Cross, the Flagellants, and their arrival has just shattered the bleak, monotonous despair of your town, replacing it with a new and volatile kind of madness. The ritual in the square continues for what feels like an eternity. The sun beats down on the blood-streaked backs of the men, their chanting rising to a fever pitch. Finally, as if a switch has been flipped, it stops. The men stand, swaying, their chests heaving, their bodies glistening with sweat and blood. The master steps into the center of the circle and begins to preach. His voice is raw, powerful, and filled with an absolute, unshakable certainty that you haven't heard since the plague began. He doesn't offer gentle platitudes or vague hopes. He offers a diagnosis and a cure, a chillingly simple explanation for the catastrophe that has befallen the world. God, he thunders, is not just angry. He is incandescent with rage. Mankind has become so mired in sin, so decadent and corrupt, that God has unleashed this pestilence not just as a punishment, but as a prelude to the final judgment. The apocalypse is at hand, but the Master proclaims there is one last hope. God, in his infinite mercy, has left a single path to salvation. If mankind can demonstrate a penance as extreme as its sin, if it can show God a suffering that mirrors the suffering of his own Son on the cross, then he might relent. He might stay his hand. Their prayers, the Master scoffs, are just empty words. Your confessions to priests are meaningless whispers. The only prayer God will hear now is the prayer written in blood. The only penance he will accept is the penance of the flesh. He explains the logic of the lash. Every strike of the whip is a blow against sin. Every drop of their blood is a tear of repentance. They are, he claims, taking the sins of the world onto their own backs. They are performing a collective, voluntary crucifixion to save humanity from the plague. It is a terrifyingly direct transaction with the divine. You're paying for God's mercy. He tells the crowd, your small, mesmerized group of survivors, that the church has failed them. The priests have grown fat and complacent. They hide behind their stone walls and their fancy vestments, offering no real solutions. The Flagellants, he declares, are the true soldiers of Christ, a lay movement of the faithful who have taken matters into their own hands. They answer to no bishop, no priest. They answer only to God. This is a profoundly radical and dangerous idea. For your entire life, the church has been the unquestioned intermediary between you and God. To suggest that ordinary people could bypass it, could form their own direct line to the Almighty, is a heresy of the highest order. But in this moment, with the evidence of the church's failure all around you in the form of endless graves, his words have a powerful, seductive appeal. He even quotes scripture, twisting passages to fit his narrative, speaking with the authority of a prophet. He talks about the 33.5 years of Christ's life on earth. This, he explains, is why their pilgrimage of penance lasts for 33.5 days. Each day is a year in the life of the Savior. They travel from town to town, performing their ritual twice a day and once on Sunday, offering up their suffering for the souls of all. You learn a strange and specific detail about their beliefs. They believe that the blood shed during their rituals has miraculous properties. They call it a holy relic, a new baptism. After the ceremony, you see some of the more desperate townsfolk creep forward with small pieces of cloth, dipping them in the puddles of blood on the cobblestones. They believe this blood-soaked cloth can cure the sick, that it can ward off the plague. It's a folk magic born of extreme desperation, a tangible symbol of hope in a world that has none. The logic is twisted, but it's a logic nonetheless, and that's what makes it so powerful. The plague is a chaotic, senseless force. The Flagellants offer a framework to understand it. It is not random, it is a specific punishment for a specific cause. And it has a specific cause. And it has a specific cure. The price is pain, the currency is blood. The currency is blood. As the Master's sermon ends and the brothers of the cross begin to tend to their wounds, you are left reeling. The world, which had dissolved into meaningless suffering, suddenly has a terrifying kind of sense again. And the path forward is no longer about hiding and praying, but about a brutal, bloody, and desperate act of faith. As the Flagellants remain in your town for a day or two, resting before moving on, you begin to see that behind the frenzied, bloody ritual lies a surprisingly rigid and organized structure. This is not just a spontaneous outburst of madness. It is a disciplined, quasi-monastic order on the move. Their life is governed by a strict set of rules, a code of conduct that is as unyielding as their theology. You see it in the way they comport themselves after the ceremony. The ecstasy of the lash gives way to a quiet, somber discipline. They do not carouse or seek comfort. They sleep on the hard ground, often in the churchyard, refusing any offers of a soft bed. They eat only enough to sustain their journey, a little bread, and then look after one another, tending to their shared wounds with a practiced, almost tender care. Someone in the town who can read gets a look at a document one of the pilgrims carries, a letter or charter that outlines their code. The news of what it says spreads quickly. To join the movement, a man must pledge to be a member for the full 33.5 days. He must also have enough money to pay for his own food during that time, a practical rule ensuring they aren't seen as mere beggars. This little detail suggests a surprising level of foresight from their leaders. Historians still debate the origins of these founding masters. Were they failed priests, charismatic laymen, or something else entirely? Whatever their background, they were clearly effective organizers. The rules are incredibly strict regarding personal conduct. Members are forbidden from speaking to women. They cannot wash themselves or change their clothes for the duration of the pilgrimage. This rule, born from a desire for extreme penance, had the rather unfortunate and ironic side effect of making them incredibly dirty and likely covered in fleas, the very creatures that carried the plague. It's a tragic detail that underscores the profound gap between their faith and the reality of the disease. Most importantly, each new member must swear an oath of absolute obedience to the master of his particular group. The master's word is law. He has the authority to hear confessions and grant absolution, a right that is supposed to be reserved exclusively for ordained priests. This is one of the key elements that will later draw the intense wrath of the church. They are not just a lay movement, they are a parallel church with their own leaders, their own rituals, and their own path to salvation. You also learn more about the ritual itself. The triple thong-head scourge with its metal studs is not a random invention. It is a carefully designed instrument of penance, and each member is expected to own and maintain his own. The songs they sing are not just random hymns. They are unique to the movement, their melodies haunting and their lyrics filled with apocalyptic warnings and pleas for mercy. You hear one song being sung quietly among them as they rest, a mournful tune that will become famous across Europe. It tells the story of their pilgrimage, of their suffering for the sins of the world. These songs acted as a powerful bonding agent, a shared anthem for their suffering. There is a strict hierarchy. The master is at the top. Below him are lieutenants who help maintain order. And then there are the rank-and-file brothers. When they march from town to town, they do so with a military-like precision, banners held high, always walking 2 by 2. This discipline and organization are part of what makes them so compelling and so threatening. They are not a disorganized mob. They are an army of penitents. You witness a new member being initiated. It's a young man from your own town, a Krupa's son whose entire family was taken by the plague. He has nothing left to lose. He stands before the master, confesses all his sins since the age of 7, and swears the oath. He is then given his scourge and a simple robe. The other members welcome him, not with a handshake, but with a solemn nod. He has joined the Brotherhood of the Lash. He has traded his old, ruined life for a new one with a clear and brutal purpose. The sight of it sends a chill down your spine. It's a testament to the sheer desperation the plague has created, a desperation so deep that this life of ritualized suffering seems like a rational, even hopeful choice. The day before the Flagellants are set to leave your town, you find yourself in a quiet corner of the churchyard where some of them are resting. You are not seeking them out, not really, but your path crosses with one of the brothers who is sitting alone, mending a strap on his worn leather sandals. He is younger than you expected up close, perhaps not much older than you. His face is etched with a weariness that goes beyond his years, but his eyes, when he looks up at you, are startlingly clear. He doesn't speak at first. He just gives you a small, almost imperceptible nod. The silence hangs between you, thick with unspoken questions. Buoyed by a strange mix of fear and curiosity, you ask him a simple question: why? He seems to consider the question for a long time, his gaze drifting towards the fresh mounds of earth that now dot the churchyard like a pox. "Why does the farmer till his field?" he finally asks, his voice raspy. "For the harvest. Our bodies are the field. Our pain is the plow. And the harvest is God's mercy." He tells you his story. He was a weaver from a town a week's journey to the east. He had a wife, 2 small children. He uses the past tense. The plague, he says, took them all in the space of 4 days. He describes a feeling you have come to know intimately, the profound, crushing helplessness. He prayed, he fasted, he gave alms to the church. He did everything he was supposed to do. "The priests told me it was God's will," he says, his voice devoid of emotion. "They told me to pray for their souls. But what about our bodies? What about the world of the living?" Prayer felt like whispering into a storm. Then, he says, the Brothers of the Cross came to his town. And for the first time since the sickness began, he felt a purpose. "Look around you," he says, gesturing to the desolate streets of your town. "The world is drowning. The priests are telling us to stand still and wait for the water to recede." He explains their cause not as an act of madness, but as the only sane response to an insane world. When all the old rules have failed, you must create new ones. When God is silent, you must shout loud enough for him to hear. He describes the feeling of the lash not as pain, but as a release. It is a way of taking all the grief, all the fear, all the powerless rage, and turning it into something active, something meaningful. With every strike, he says, touching the scourge that lies beside him, "I am not just punishing myself. I am fighting back." He extends an invitation, though it's not worded as such. It's more of a gentle, logical proposition. "You have lost people," he says, and it's a statement, not a question. Everyone has. You can stay here and wait for the sickness to find you. Or you can join us on the road. You can take up the cross and the scourge, and you can offer your own suffering to save what is left of the world. It is a hard path, but it is a path. The only path left. He tells you about a strange, ancillary belief they hold, which is that any person who joins them and completes the full 33-day pilgrimage is guaranteed to be cleansed of all sin. It's a kind of spiritual loophole, an idea that historians believe was incredibly appealing to a populace terrified not just of dying, but of dying without a proper confession and last rites, which had become nearly impossible to get. A guaranteed ticket to heaven paid for in blood. As he speaks, you feel a terrifying pull. His certainty is a beacon in the fog of your own fear and doubt. His words offer a narrative that makes sense of the senseless. It reframes you from a helpless victim waiting for the soul of mankind. For a moment you imagine it, leaving this town of ghosts behind, joining the rhythmic march, feeling the rhythmic march, feeling the cold leather of the scourge in your hand, finding a place in that circle of shared, ecstatic agony. It feels like a choice between 2 kinds of death, a meaningless, lonely death in a plague-ridden bed, or a meaningful, communal death on the penitence road. And in the upside-down logic of this new world, the second one almost sounds like a victory. The Flagellants leave your town at dawn, a line of dark figures receding into the morning mist. A few people from your town, including the young man you saw initiated, go with them. A profound quiet descends once more, but it's a different kind of quiet now, laced with the memory of their chants and the faint, coppery smell of blood that still seems to hang in the air of the square. A week or so later, a traveler passes through, a merchant taking a risky, circuitous route to avoid the worst of the plague-stricken areas. He brings news from a neighboring town, a place you know well, about a day's journey from your own. He tells a story that sends a fresh wave of confusion and fear through your community. He says the Flagellants arrived there a few days ago, and the town's reception was different. He describes a scene of almost manic celebration. Unlike your town's stunned, fearful curiosity, the people of that town greeted the Flagellants as living saints. When the procession approached their gates, the town's bells began to ring, not with the slow, mournful toll for the dead, but with a joyous, frantic peal, the kind usually reserved for a royal visit or a great military victory. The townspeople, he says, lined the streets, falling to their knees as the brothers of the cross passed by. They threw flowers in their path. Women held up their children, hoping for a blessing from these grim, bloody figures. They saw them not as heretics or madmen, but as an answer to their prayers, a direct intervention from God. The local priests, seeing the mood of the populace, either joined in the welcome or wisely stayed out of the way, unwilling to challenge the tidal wave of popular support. The traveler describes how the Flagellants were led to the market square, and when they began their ritual of penance, the townspeople did not just watch. They participated. As the brothers whipped themselves, men and women in the crowd began to weep and cry out, confessing their own sins aloud for all to hear. Some of the local men, caught up in the mass hysteria, even began to beat their own chests with their fists, desperate to join in the act of penance in any way they could. After the ritual, the town's mayor and wealthy citizens opened their homes to the Flagellants, offering them the best food and wine, offerings the core members, true to their code, would have refused, though by this point the movement was attracting less disciplined followers. The townsfolk treated them like celebrities, like holy relics come to life. They begged them to stay, believing that the very presence of these holy men in their town would create a protective shield against the plague. This reception highlights a fascinating and complex aspect of the movement. Their popularity was not universal. It depended entirely on the specific conditions and the collective mood of each town they visited. Historians are still trying to map the precise path of the various Flagellants groups and correlate it with local plague intensity and political stability. It seems that in places where the devastation was most complete and the local authority, both secular and religious, had utterly collapsed, the Flagellants were most likely to be welcomed as saviors. They filled a power vacuum. The traveler also shares a peculiar, almost absurd detail. He says the people of that town were so convinced of the Flagellants' holiness that they began fighting over their bathwater. This is a recurring, if perhaps apocryphal, story from the era. The belief was that because the pilgrims were so saintly, even their dirt was holy, and washing in their used water could impart some of their protective aura. Given their rule against washing, one can only imagine how little water there was to fight over, and how incredibly grimy it must have been. Hearing this news, you feel a profound sense of unease. You saw the Flagellants up close. You saw the cold fury in their ritual and the dangerous certainty in their leaders' eyes. You recognized the genuine despair that drove them. But to hear of them being celebrated, deified even, is deeply troubling. It feels like the world is not just dying, but that its very sense of judgment is dying too. The line between piety and blasphemy, between sainthood and madness, seems to have been completely erased. And you realize the Flagellants movement is like a fire. In your town, it was a contained, mesmerizing flame. But in other places, fanned by the winds of total desperation, it was becoming a raging, uncontrollable inferno. Your imagination begins to follow the Flagellants on their grim pilgrimage, piecing together scraps of news from travelers and your own memories of their brief, intense stay. You start to build a picture of their daily life on the road, a life stripped down to the barest, harshest essentials of survival and ritual. Their day begins before sunrise with a prayer in the cold, damp dark. There is no comfort, no lingering in warmth. They rise from the hard ground, shake the frost or dew from their robes, and prepare for the day's march. Their only meal is a meager one, a piece of dry bread, perhaps washed down with water from a stream. The constant hunger is just another part of their penance, a dull ache that sharpens the senses and, they believe, purifies the soul. Then comes the march. They walk for hours in all weathers. Under the scorching summer sun that bakes the open road, their woolen robes become instruments of torture. In the biting wind and chilling rain of autumn, their clothes are perpetually dark, clinging to their skin and chilling them to the bone. Their bare feet are a map of their journey, calloused, bruised, and often cut by the rough tracks they follow. They move with that relentless to precision, the dark river of suffering flowing across the landscape. The road itself is a landscape of death. They walk past abandoned farmsteads, the fields overgrown with weeds. They pass through hamlets where every single house is marked with the red cross of the plague, the silence within more terrifying than any scream. The world they travel through is an open grave, a constant, visceral reminder of the urgency of their mission. This journey through a dying world must have had a profound psychological effect, reinforcing their belief that the end was nigh and that their extreme actions were not just justified but necessary. When they arrive at a new town, the ritual is always the same. The solemn entry, the formation of the circle in the square, the litany, the prostration, and then the bloody crescendo of the scourging. Twice a day, they open the wounds on their backs, pushing their bodies to the very limits of endurance. Medical historians have long debated how they survived this ordeal. The constant reopening of wounds in such indefinite conditions should have led to mass infections and death. Some speculate that the specific type of metal used in their scourges, perhaps iron, had some minor antiseptic properties when it rusted, or that the sheer repetitive trauma somehow cauterized the wounds. The truth is, we don't really know. Their survival rate was, in itself, seen by many as a miracle. After the evening ritual, they perform their duties. They tend to each other's wounds, not with a strange stoicism, cleaning them as best they can with scraps of cloth. They repair their scourges, tightening the leather thongs, sharpening the metal points. There is a chilling practicality to their devotion. These are not just instruments of faith, they are the tools of their trade, and they must be kept in working order. Life on the road is a strange mix of public spectacle and private misery. In the town square, they are actors in a grand, divine drama. On the road between towns, they are just a collection of exhausted, hungry, and wounded men. You wonder about the moments of doubt. Was there ever a man who, in the cold misery of a rainy night, questioned his decision? Who longed for the simple comfort of a warm bed and a full meal? The movement was not monolithic. It was made up of thousands of individuals, each with his own story of loss and despair. And inevitably, not all of them were true zealots. As their fame grew, they began to attract a less savory element, opportunists, beggars who saw the movement as a source of free food and lodging in welcoming towns, and criminals who used the anonymity of the hood to hide from the law. This dilution of their original pious purpose was a seed of their eventual downfall. The initial discipline began to fray as their numbers swelled. You recall the young man from your town who joined them. You try to imagine his journey. The initial fervor, the sense of purpose, the camaraderie of shared suffering. But then, the reality. The gnawing hunger, the septic wounds, the sheer, grinding monotony of the march and the ritual. You picture his face, once familiar, now hidden beneath a hood, his back a canvas of ritualized pain. He is no longer the cooper's son. He is a brother of the cross, a pilgrim on a bloody road, walking towards a salvation that seems to demand the complete destruction of the self. As you piece together the stories and rumors, one figure looms large in your imagination, the master. You saw him in your town square, the man who commanded the circle of suffering with a simple gesture, whose voice alone seemed to hold the power of conviction. You realize that the entire Flagellants movement, despite its appearance of chaotic fervor, is built upon the absolute authority of these charismatic leaders. Each group, each wandering band of penitents, has its own master. He is their commander, their confessor, and their prophet. His authority is not derived from a church hierarchy or a noble title. It comes directly from the force of his personality and the compelling power of his preaching. He is chosen, it seems, by acclaim, recognized by his followers as the one most filled with the divine spirit, the one who can best articulate their shared mission. You picture him at the head of the procession, his stride more determined, his gaze more intense than the others. He doesn't just lead the rituals, he embodies them. When he preaches, his words are not just scripture, they are presented as direct revelations from God. He might claim that an angel appeared to him in a dream, delivering a letter that sanctioned their pilgrimage and outlined their holy duties. This claim of direct divine communication is a classic hallmark of charismatic leaders in times of crisis, and it's a direct challenge to the Church's role as the sole interpreter of God's will. His control over his followers is total. You saw how they obeyed his every signal without question, dropping to the ground, rising, and beginning their penance in perfect, horrifying unison. On the road, his word determines their pace, their route, where they rest. He settles disputes, enforces the strict rules of the brotherhood, and has the power to expel any member who breaks his oath. To be expelled would be a terrible fate. Cast out from the only community that gives your life meaning, branded as an oath breaker in a world that takes such things very seriously. He is also their spiritual guide. The members confess their sins to him, not to a priest, and the master grants them absolution. This usurpation of the sacrament of confession is one of the most heretical aspects of their movement. In your world, the power to forgive sins is a sacred authority passed down from Christ to the apostles, and then to the ordained priests. For a layman, a simple weaver or farmer, to claim this power is unthinkable. It strikes at the very foundation of the Church's power. Historians still speculate about who these masters really were. Some were likely former clergy, perhaps low-level priests or monks who were disillusioned with the Church's ineffective response to the plague. They would have had the theological knowledge and the rhetorical skill to craft the movement's ideology. Others may have been charismatic artisans or peasants, natural-born leaders who found their calling in the midst of chaos. There is even a fringe theory that some masters were disgraced nobles or political agitators, using the religious fervor of the masses for their own ends, though evidence for this is scarce. You think about the psychology of it. For the followers, surrendering their will to the master must have been a profound relief. In a world where every choice felt meaningless, where your own life and death were completely out of your hands, having someone tell you exactly what to do, what to believe, and how to suffer would be a powerful comfort. It replaces the anxiety of freedom with the security of obedience. The master's certainty becomes their certainty. One peculiar story here illustrates the depth of this obedience. Traveler tells of a Flagellants master who, to test his followers, commanded them to walk into a river. Without hesitation, they began to march into the cold water, fully prepared to drown if he did not tell them to stop. The story may be an exaggeration, but it captures the essence of the relationship, a complete and total submission of the self to the will of the leader. This cult of personality around the master is both the movement's greatest weakness. It allows for rapid growth and incredible discipline. But it also means that the character of each Flagellants is entirely dependent on the character of its leader. A pious and disciplined master might lead a group focused solely on penance, but a corrupt, ambitious, or unstable master down a much darker and more violent path. And as the movement spreads, it is this darker potential that begins to surface. The Flagellants have been on the road for months now. What began as a desperate pilgrimage of penance is subtly, almost imperceptibly beginning to transform. With every town that welcomes them as saviors, with every market square filled with awestruck onlookers, their sense of purpose swells. They are no longer just atoning for the world's sins, they are becoming a power in their own right. You begin to hear stories that are less about their rituals and more about their actions. Stories of how the Flagellants are starting to interfere with the local order of things. They march into a town, and the master's sermon isn't just about sin and repentance anymore. He starts to openly criticize the local clergy. He points to the well-fed priests, safe in his stone house, and compares him to the suffering Christ. He calls the church leaders hypocrites, accusing them of hoarding wealth while the people starve and die. This is a dangerous game, but it's one that finds a receptive audience. You and your neighbors have been paying tithes to the church your whole lives, supporting it in the belief that it would support you in times of crisis. But in this greatest of all crises, the church has offered only empty words and ineffective rituals. The Flagellants' accusations, however crude, resonate with a deep, simmering resentment. You see people who once bowed their heads to the parish priest now nodding in agreement with the Flagellants master. The movement starts to take on a judicial role. In one town, the story goes, a man known for price gouging on bread was dragged before the Flagellants master. The master held an impromptu trial in the square, declared the man guilty in the eyes of God, and ordered him to be flogged alongside the brothers in their next ritual. The town's actual mayor and council were powerless to stop it, swept aside by the tide of popular support for the Flagellants. They were becoming a law unto themselves, dispensing a swift and brutal form of justice that bypassed all established authority. Their influence extends even to the political sphere. In some cities, their arrival triggers near riots, not of protest against them, but in their favor. This evolution from a purely religious movement to a socio-political force is something that historians find fascinating. Was this a conscious goal from the start, a kind of peasant revolt cloaked in the robes of piety? Or was it an accidental byproduct of their immense popularity? The academic consensus leans towards the latter. The Flagellants likely never set out to overthrow lords or bishops, but their radical theology, the idea that lay people could commune directly with God and take their salvation into their own hands, was inherently revolutionary. It contained the seeds of a rebellion against the entire medieval power structure. You hear a very specific and telling piece of gossip. In a city to the north, the Flagellants performed their ritual in front of the bishop's palace. After the ceremony, the master preached a sermon on the sin of greed, all while staring directly at the palace's ornate windows. He didn't have to name the bishop, everyone understood. The next day, the bishop made a very large, and very public, donation of grain to the city's poor. He may not have been moved by piety, but he was certainly moved by the fear of a mob incited by a charismatic, blood-soaked preacher. This is the turning point. The Flagellants are no longer just a strange, apocalyptic cult. They are a threat. They are undermining the authority of the church, challenging the power of secular rulers, and demonstrating that a sufficiently motivated and organized group of common people can bend the will of the powerful. They are a destabilizing agent in an already destabilized world. The very lords and bishops who might have initially dismissed them as a band of harmless fanatics are now beginning to watch their progress with a growing sense of alarm. The line between saint and sedition is becoming dangerously blurred. This growing power has a strange effect. A movement born from a desire to absorb God's wrath by punishing the self is now looking for other outlets for its righteous fury. The simple theology that the plague is a punishment for sin begs a follow-up question that hangs unspoken in the air of every town they visit: whose sin? At first, the answer was abstract: mankind's sin. But that is a difficult, unsatisfying enemy to fight. A tide of anger and certainty like the one they've unleashed needs a focus. It needs a face. And so the search for answers begins to curdle into a hunt for scapegoats. You start to hear a new, venomous thread woven into the sermons of the Flagellants masters. The stories that reach you from other towns are no longer just about their rituals of penance. They are about outbreaks of violence that follow in their wake. The shadow of blame is beginning to fall, and it falls most heavily on the oldest and most convenient target in Christian Europe, the Jewish communities. The logic is twisted, but horribly simple. If the prayers of the faithful are not working, then perhaps the presence of the unfaithful is to blame. The masters begin to preach that the sin of dispolluting the very air, provoking God's anger more than any common vice. Soon, this theological accusation merges with the basest of folk superstitions. The old, baseless rumor that Jewish people are poisoning the wells to kill Christians is revived and spread with a new, fervent intensity. In the Flagellants' apocalyptic worldview, it makes a kind of perfect, paranoid sense. This isn't just a random act of nature. It is a conspiracy, an attack. You hear of towns where, shortly after the Flagellants' arrival, the local citizenry, whipped into a frenzy by the masters preaching, marches on the Jewish quarter. They become a mob with the Flagellants acting not as participants, but as the holy catalyst, the spark that ignites the dry tinder of pre-existing prejudice. Historians are still locked in a fierce debate over this aspect of the movement. Was this violent antisemitic plan part of the Flagellants ideology from the beginning, a calculated tool for recruitment and control, or was it more of an opportunistic development, where individual masters found that blaming the local Jewish community was an easy way to win popular support and deflect that their rituals weren't actually stopping the plague? But the results were tragically clear. In numerous towns across the Holy Roman Empire, the arrival of the Flagellants was a death sentence for the Jewish population. But the blame doesn't stop there. The Flagellants' quest for purity becomes an obsession, and they start to season everywhere. Their judgment falls upon anyone who seems to be enjoying life too much in the face of God's wrath. You hear a peculiar story about a group of Flagellants entering a town and, after their ritual, marching to the local tavern. They don't go there to drink. They smash the barrels of ale, proclaiming them to be devil's brew. They seize dice from gamblers and throw them into a bonfire, along with other vanities like colorful ribbons, fine clothes, and even musical instruments. This puritanical rage is a new and alarming development. They are no longer content to police their own behavior. They are now attempting to police the behavior of everyone around them. They become a self-appointed moral militia. A woman accused of vanity for wearing a brightly colored scarf might be publicly shamed. A man heard singing a bawdy song might be accused of inciting God's anger. This changes everything for you. Before, the Flagellants were a phenomenon you could watch with a mixture of horror and fascination. They were a self-contained spectacle of suffering. But now, their gaze is turning outward. You are no longer just an observer of their penance, you are a potential object of their judgment. The atmosphere in your own town becomes tense. People start to watch what they say, how they dress. A nervous, performative piety takes hold. The movement that claimed to be taking the world's sins onto its own back is now aggressively seeking out sinners to punish. The shadow of blame is long, and you realize with a sickening lurch that it could fall on anyone. The fear the Flagellants left behind is a strange one. It's not just the fear of their judgment or their violence. It's a deeper, more unsettling fear, the fear that they might be right. As they continue their journey, a new kind of story begins to trickle back to your town, carried by the same travelers who once brought tales of their brutality. These new stories are not of violence, but of wonders. You hear of a town to the south where the Flagellants performed their ritual. That very same day, the death toll from the plague, which had been rising steadily for weeks, suddenly dropped to 0. And it stayed there. The town, the story goes, was miraculously spared. Then comes another tale, more personal, more potent. A child, pronounced dead from the fever, was touched by the bloody scourge of a passing Flagellant. A moment later, the child supposedly sat up, blinked, and asked for a piece of bread. A blind woman in a village is said to have regained her sight just from the sound of their penitential hymns. These are the stories of miracles, and they spread like wildfire, far faster and more effectively than the plague itself. For every tale of them inciting a riot, there are now 2 tales of them performing a miracle. The movement is gaining a supernatural aura. They are not just holy men, they are conduits of divine power. And a new powerful belief begins to attach itself to them, a belief that he whispered with a tone of absolute conviction. The Flagellants themselves are immune to the plague. They walk through dying towns, surround themselves with the sick, and perform their bloody rituals in the most unsanitary conditions imaginable, yet they do not fall ill. This is seen as the ultimate proof of God's favor. Of course, from a modern perspective, it's a statistical anomaly at best. Many likely did get sick and die, their death simply not reported or integrated into the myth. But in a world desperate for signs, their apparent immunity is the most powerful sign of all. This is where the line between faith and mass hysteria begins to dissolve completely. Are these miracles real? Are they the products of a collective, desperate imagination? Historians still argue about the origin of these stories. Were they a form of deliberate propaganda, consciously crafted and spread by the Flagellants masters to bolster their authority and ensure a warm welcome in the next town? Or were they grassroots phenomena, spontaneous rumors born from the desperate need to find hope in the abyss? The truth is likely a complex mixture of both. A master might subtly suggest a miracle occurred, and a terrified, hopeful populace would do the rest, embellishing the story and passing it on as gospel truth. The effect of these stories is profound. They create a feedback loop of fervor. The more miracles are reported, the more new recruits flock to their banners, and the larger and more intimidating their processions become. The movement is no longer just about penance, it's about power. The power to heal, the power to save, the power to defy the plague itself. This psychic contagion seeps back into your own town. You see its effects on your neighbors. An elderly woman who can barely walk claims she saw a vision of the Virgin Mary, who told her the Flagellants were her chosen sons. A farmer is convinced that a strangely shaped cloud is a sign of God's approval of the movement. People start looking for omens everywhere, in the flight of birds, in the patterns of spilled water, reinterpreting the entire world through the lens of this new, radical faith. You find yourself caught in the middle. Your rational mind, what's left of it, tells you these stories are impossible. But your heart, weary from months of grief and fear, desperately wants to believe them. You start to question your own senses. Did you dismiss them too quickly? Was their bloody ritual truly an act of madness? Or was it a form of divine communion? You were simply too blind to understand. The world feels enchanted and terrifying all at once. A place where the dead can rise and the blind can see, but only if you submit to the logic of the lash. The very air seems to crackle with a strange, nervous energy, and you realize the Flagellants have unleashed something far more potent than a social movement. They have unleashed a contagious dream of miracles, and its fever is beginning to infect everyone. The Flagellants movement, fueled by its growing reputation for miracles and holy terror, seems like an unstoppable force. Band after band roams the countryside, swelling in number, their authority growing with every town that welcomes them. It feels as if the whole world is being swept up in this tide of bloody piety. But then, you hear a new and surprising piece of news. It's a story of rejection. It comes from a large, walled city to the west, a major center of trade and power. The Flagellants, a particularly large and boisterous procession of them, arrived at its gates, expecting the usual welcome. They would have anticipated ringing bells, kneeling citizens, and a cowed city council ready to hand over the keys, but the gates remained shut. High on the stone walls, the city's guards stood with crossbows at the ready. The mayor of the city, flanked by wealthy merchants and the local bishop, appeared on the ramparts. He held a scroll, a proclamation from the city council. In a loud, clear voice that carried down to the stunned procession, he declared the Flagellants to be a public nuisance, a source of civil unrest, and a potential health hazard. They were denied entry. You can almost picture the scene, the sea of hooded figures, whips in hand, standing in shocked silence before the massive, impassive gates. Their master steps forward to preach, to rally the crowd within the city to his cause, but his voice is swallowed by the sheer stone of the walls. There is no market square to fill, no populace to incite. There is only the cold, hard refusal of established power. This moment is a crucial turning point. It demonstrates that the Flagellants' power is entirely dependent on popular consent. In small towns hollowed out by plague and despair, they could fill the vacuum of authority. But in a well-organized, well-defended city, where the leaders had managed to maintain control, perhaps the plague's grip was weaker there, or the social order was simply more resilient. Their tactics were useless. Their power was based on moral suasion and intimidation, and when a city government refused to be intimidated, they had no answer. The city's rejection is based on a complex mix of motives. The bishop would have seen them as dangerous heretics, a direct threat to his own spiritual authority. The merchants on the council would have seen them as a threat to commerce and stability. A massive, unpredictable cult camping outside your walls is simply bad for business. And there was also the growing, pragmatic concern that these wandering, unwashed groups were not driving the plague away, but were in fact spreading it from town to town. While the science of contagion was non-existent, the empirical observation that trouble often followed in their wake was beginning to register with more astute civic leaders. The Flagellants, faced with this unprecedented rejection, did not know how to react. They performed their bloody ritual outside the city walls, a theatrical display of defiance. But it was a performance without its intended audience. The citizens watched from the safety of the ramparts, their fascination now tempered by the official disapproval of their leaders. The ritual, which seemed so powerful in the heart of a welcoming town, now just looked like a strange, desperate act in an open field. After a day or two of this futile display, they gave up and moved on humiliated. But the story of their rejection travels faster than they do. It's a crack in their aura of invincibility. It shows other towns, other leaders that it is possible to say no. It's an example of resistance. The debate over the Flagellants was never just about theology. It was also about public order. And this is a point where historians find a lot of rich material in the surviving town council records from this period. While some councils voted to welcome them, hoping for a miracle, others recorded detailed debates, weighing the potential spiritual benefits against the very real risks of riots, violence, and the disruption of what little civic life remained. The decision to shut the gates was a calculated risk, a bet that the wrath of the Flagellants was less dangerous than the chaos they brought with them. For you, hearing this news brings a strange sense of relief. It's a reminder that the whole world has not, in fact, gone mad. Reason, or at least a pragmatic kind of self-interest, still has a foothold. The story of the closed gates is the first sign that the tide might be turning, that the power of this movement, which seemed so absolute and divinely sanctioned, has its limits, and its limits are a stone wall. The news of cities shutting their gates is a significant development, but the Flagellants movement is a wildfire that has already spread too far, too fast. Its sparks have crossed borders, ignited popular fervor in France, the Low Countries, and deep into the Holy Roman Empire. The problem has become too big for local mayors and bishops to handle alone. The stories of their strange rituals, their heretical claims, and the civil unrest they leave in their wake are now traveling along the same clerical and diplomatic routes as reports on the plague itself, and they are all heading to one place, Avignon. In your mind, you picture this city in the south of France. It's a world away from your muddy, timber-framed town. Avignon is a city of palaces and high culture, and for most of the 14th century, it is the home of the Pope. The papacy had moved from Rome to Avignon some years earlier, a controversial decision that left the Pope seeming more like a French prince than the universal father of Christendom. And in this opulent VI, Clement is not a simple parish priest. He is a shrewd politician, a man of refined tastes, and a skilled administrator. He is also a man sitting at the heart of a web of information, perhaps the most extensive in the medieval world. His network of bishops and legates are his eyes and ears, and what they are telling him about this Flagellants movement is deeply alarming. At first, the reports might have been dismissed as isolated incidents of local hysteria, but the pattern is now undeniable. He hears of the Flagellants' claims to absolve sins, a direct usurpation of priestly power. He hears how they preach without the sanction of any bishop, a flagrant violation of church law. He hears of their supposed letter from an angel, a claim of direct revelation that bypasses the authority of the church entirely. And most troubling lie, he hears of the violence, the attacks on clergy, and the pogroms against Jewish communities that follow in their path. Clement VI is, by the standards of his time, a surprisingly rational man. While the plague raged, he famously sat between two enormous fires in his chambers, the belief being that the heat would purify the air and ward off the miasma. It was a scientifically incorrect theory, of course, but it was a theory nonetheless, an attempt to find a physical solution to a physical problem, which set him apart from the purely superstitious responses of many. He also issued a papal bull protecting Jewish people, stating that they were not to blame for the plague and were, in fact, suffering from it just like Christians. He understood that they were being used as scapegoats. Historians still debate Clement's primary motivation for turning against the Flagellants. Was it a genuine theological concern for the purity of the faith and the souls of these misguided zealots? Was it a humanitarian concern over the violence and social chaos they were causing? Or was it, most cynically, a purely political calculation? The Flagellants were a rival power. They were draining the church of its authority, its prestige, and potentially, its revenue. Their popularity was a direct indictment of the church's failure, and Clement, as the head of that church, could not let such a challenge go unanswered. The most likely answer is that it was a combination of all three. From his palace in Avignon, he begins to take action. He sends out letters to his bishops across Europe, instructing them to condemn the movement from their pulpits. He orders them to forbid their flocks from joining the processions. He commands them to deny the Flagellants food, shelter, or any form of support. It is a declaration of war, fought not with swords, but with sermons and sacraments. You don't see these letters, of course. You can read Latin, but you feel their effect. Your local priest, who had been cowed into silence by the Flagellants' popularity, now seems emboldened. One Sunday he delivers a sermon, the first of its kind you've heard, in which he cautiously, but firmly, denounces the brothers of the cross. He calls their rituals a mockery of true penance, their leaders false prophets, and their beliefs a dangerous heresy. He warns you that to follow them is to risk not salvation but eternal damnation. The message is clear. The highest authority in Christendom has spoken. The quiet alarm that was growing in the halls of power has now become a public denunciation. The Flagellants are no longer just a problem for a few town councils. They are now the official enemies of the Holy See. A great, slow-moving institutional power has finally awakened, and it is beginning to grind its gears in opposition to the hysterical piety of the people. While the Pope in Avignon is drafting his condemnations, the Flagellants on the road are unaware that the tide of official opinion is turning against them. They are still lost in the world they have created for themselves, a world of ritual, pain, and a strange, shared ecstasy. To truly understand the movement, you have to try and imagine what it felt like to be inside that circle. Picture it again in your mind's eye. You are in the center of a town square. The day is fading. The faces of the onlookers are a pale, flickering blur in the torchlight. The ritual has begun. You are one of the brothers standing in the circle, your scourge held loosely in your hand. The master's voice is a low drone, reciting the litany of sins. With each one, you prostrate yourself on the cold, hard cobblestones. The impact jars your bones. A small, sharp shock of pain that brings your focus into the present moment. Then you rise. The chanting begins. It starts slow, a mournful hum that you feel in your chest as much as you hear with your ears. You begin to move, taking the first slow steps of the circle. And then you swing your arm, bringing the scourge over your shoulder. The first blow lands. The pain is sharp, electric. It makes you gasp. Your mind screams in protest. This is unnatural, wrong. But you don't stop. The man in front of you doesn't stop. You are locked together in this rhythmic, brutal dance. With the second blow, the pain is still there, but it's different. It's no longer a surprise. With the third and the fourth, something begins to shift. The constant, rhythmic agony starts to have a hypnotic effect. The sharp edges of the pain begin to blur. Your chanting grows louder, more fervent. The slow rhythm of the circle begins to speed up. The individual sounds of the whips striking flesh merge into a single, continuous, terrifying roar. You are no longer just you, a single man in a circle. You are a part of a larger organism, a single body of shared suffering. The pain is not just your pain anymore, it is our pain. This is the point where a strange, powerful psychological phenomenon takes over. Modern science might call it a combination of sensory overload, endorphin release, and the powerful effects of group hypnosis. The constant chanting, the rhythmic movement, the intense pain, it all combines to induce a trance-like state. The world outside the circle dissolves. The faces of the crowd vanish. There is only the rhythm, the pain, and the overwhelming sense of communion with the men around you. In this state, you might experience visions. You might see the face of Christ in the torchlight, his expression a mixture of agony and approval. You might hear the voice of the Virgin Mary whispering encouragement in your ear. These experiences feel profoundly, unshakably real. They are a confirmation that what you are doing is not only right, but divinely inspired. This ecstatic state is the emotional core of the movement. It's the spiritual reward for the physical price they pay, a feeling of being closer to God than any church service could ever bring them. Historians and sociologists are fascinated by this phenomenon of collective effervescence, the way a group of people can generate a shared emotional energy that transcends the individual. The Flagellants circle is one of the most extreme examples in history. It binds the followers together with a bond stronger than any oath. They have shared an experience that no one outside the circle can ever truly understand. A very strange, and not often mentioned, part of the ritual sometimes occurred at the very end. After the main scourging, two brothers would sometimes stand over a third, who would be lying on the ground, and whip him as a final act of penance for a specific sin. This act, called the pardoning, demonstrates just how far they had gone in creating their own unique liturgy. a complete system of sin and absolution enacted through ritualized violence. When the ritual finally ends and you collapse, exhausted, onto the ground, the feeling is not one of misery. It is one of profound release, of purification. You feel emptied out, cleansed. You look at the blood-spattered faces of your brothers, and you feel a love for them that is fierce and absolute. You have walked through the fire together. For a few brief, ecstatic moments, you have transcended the miserable, plague-ridden world and touched the face of the divine. That feeling is addictive. It is what keeps you on the road. It is what makes you lift the scourge again the next day. The fervor of the ritual circle may keep their spirits alight, but it offers no warmth against the coming cold. The movement that thrived in the long, panic days of summer and autumn now faces a new and unforgiving enemy, winter. The apocalyptic fervor that sustained them is now tested by the mundane, brutal realities of hunger and frostbite. The landscape of their pilgrimage changes. The dusty roads turn to frozen mud. The gentle rains become driving sleet and heavy snow. For men walking barefoot, or with only thin leather sandals, every step becomes an ordeal. The cold seeps into their bones, a constant, draining misery that no amount of ecstatic vision can fully banish. Their simple woolen robes, so often damp with sweat and blood, now freeze stiff, offering little protection against the biting wind. Food, which was often freely given by awestruck townsfolk, becomes scarce. Villages and farmsteads hunker down for the winter, their meager stores carefully guarded. The open-handed charity of summer evaporates in the face of the winter's lean reality. The Flagellants, who prided themselves on paying their own way, find their funds running low. Hunger is no longer just a part of their penance. It's a real annoying threat to their survival. The plague, too, behaves differently in winter. While you and your neighbors might have hoped the cold would kill the pestilence, it doesn't. The disease seems to slow its spread in some areas, but it continues its deadly work, particularly in the crowded, poorly ventilated houses where people huddle together for warmth. For the Flagellants, sleeping in open churchyards or barns, the risk of exposure is compounded by the weakening effects of cold and malnutrition. This is the point where the movement begins to fray at the edges. The discipline that held them together under the summer sun starts to break down in the frozen darkness. The less zealous members, those who joined for the promise of safety or a free meal, begin to desert. They slip away in the night, choosing the uncertain chance of solitary survival over the certain misery of the road. The character of the movement becomes harder, more desperate. Those who remain are the true believers, the hardcore zealots whose faith is only intensified by the hardship. They see the winter itself as another trial sent by God, a test of their commitment. But their desperation can also turn ugly. You hear stories of Flagellants bands, once insistent on paying for their food, now taking it by force. A farmer who refuses to give them grain might find his barn burned down, an act of divine retribution for his lack of charity. One of the more peculiar historical debates revolves around their winter attire. Did they adapt? Did they acquire shoes, heavier cloaks? Some sources suggest that local guilds or wealthy patrons would sometimes donate winter clothing, seeing it as a pie, a sacked. Other accounts imply they stubbornly refused such comforts, viewing the suffering of the cold as an essential part of their mission. The reality was likely varied, with each band making its own compromises in the face of the crippling cold. The winter also makes their main ritual more dangerous. The act of whipping a body already weakened by cold and hunger is a recipe for disaster. The wounds don't heal as quickly. The risk of infection of bad air getting into the blood is much higher. The sight of the ritual changes too. You can imagine it, a circle of shivering men, their breath missing in the frigid air, their blood steaming for a moment before freezing on the snow-dusted cobblestones. The spectacle, once terrifyingly vibrant, now takes on a quality of sheer, grim attrition. It is less a performance of ecstatic faith and more a desperate struggle against the encroaching darkness. For the young man from your town who joined them, this winter would be the ultimate test. You picture him huddled with his brothers for warmth, his stomach empty, his feet numb, the memory of his lost family perhaps feeling both closer and farther away than ever. He is no longer sustained by the cheers of welcoming crowds, but only by the rod, stubborn core of his belief and the equally stubborn will of the master who leads them, ever onward, through the frozen, dying world. While the remaining Flagellants are battling the brutal winter on the roads of Europe, a different kind of storm is finally breaking over their heads. Far away in his comfortable palace in Avignon, Pope Clement VI decides that warnings and sermons are no longer enough. The movement has proven too resilient, its appeal too strong. It is time to bring the full weight of papal authority down upon them. In October of 1349, a date that will be a crucial turning point, he issues a powerful and definitive document. It's a papal bull, the highest form of decree a pope can issue. The title of this bull is Inter Solicitones among the Cares, and its text is a complete and utter condemnation of the Flagellants movement. You, of course, never see the actual document. It's a piece of parchment covered in elegant Latin script, sealed with the Pope's own leaden seal. But its contents are quickly copied and distributed to every corner of Christendom. Bishops are commanded to read it aloud in their cathedrals. Priests are instructed to preach its message to their congregations. Its words, once spoken from the pulpit in your small town church, are a thunderclap that changes everything. The bull is a masterclass in theological and legal demolition. Clement systematically dismantles every pillar of the Flagellants' belief 3-day pilgrimage to be a vain and superstitious invention, with no basis in true church doctrine. He condemns their practice of public scourging, not because penance itself is wrong, but because their theatrical, unauthorized version is an act of pride, not humility. It is a spectacle designed to win the admiration of the crowd, not the forgiveness of God. He attacks the very heart of their movement, the authority of the masters. He thunders against these masters of error, laymen who have dared to usurp the sacred duties of the clergy. He declares that their claim to absolve sins is a blasphemous lie and that any confession made to them is worthless. He ridicules their story of the angelic letter as a foolish and wicked fabrication. Furthermore, the Pope officially condemns their psalms and their unique rituals, declaring them heretical. He forbids the faithful from joining their processions, from offering them aid, or even from listening to their sermons. Anyone who defies this papal command, the bull warns, will face the gravest of spiritual penalties, excommunication. To be excommunicated is the most terrifying fate you can imagine. It means being cast out from the church, the community of believers. It means you cannot receive the sacraments, no confession, no communion, no last rites. If you die in a state of excommunication, your soul is believed to be condemned to hell for eternity. It is a spiritual death sentence, and the Pope has just hung it over the head of every Flagellant and every one of their supporters. The debate among historians about this bull is not about its content, but its timing and effectiveness. Why did it take him so long to act decisively? Some argue Clement was cautious, waiting to gather enough information before making such a sweeping condemnation. Others suggest he was a pragmatist, waiting until the movement's popular support had already begun to wane due to their own excesses and the onset of winter. By issuing the bull then, he was not so much attacking them at their strongest, but kicking them when they were already starting to fall. This made the church appear powerful and decisive, while minimizing the risk of a major popular backlash. The effect of the papal bull is immediate and devastating for the movement. It provides the legal and theological justification that secular rulers have been waiting for. Until now, attacking a group of people who claimed to be on a holy pilgrimage was a tricky proposition. It could be seen as an act of impiety. But now, with the Pope's decree in hand, cracking down on the Flagellants is no longer an attack on faith. It is a defense of it. They are officially branded as heretics, and the word heretic is a license for anyone in power to hunt them down. The Pope's decree acts like a starter's pistol for the crowned heads of Europe. The Flagellants, who for months had been treated as either saints or a dangerous nuisance, are now officially reclassified. They are heretics. And in the 14th century, the hunt for heretics is a task that both the church and the secular states, the hunters, the men who believed they were hunting sin itself, have now become the hunted. The abstract words of the papal bull are quickly translated into the sharp, practical language of swords and crossbows. Lords, princes, and city councils, now armed with unimpeachable religious authority, begin to issue their own edicts. They forbid the Flagellants from entering their lands under penalty of imprisonment or death. Militias are raised. Knights who might have once knelt in awe before the bloody procession are now ordered to disperse them by force. You start to hear stories that are a darkened version of the ones you heard before. No longer tales of miraculous welcomes, but of brutal crackdowns. A band of Flagellants approaching a city in the German lands is met not by a welcoming committee, but by a company of armed mercenaries who ride them down in the open field. Another group, caught sheltering in a forest, is rounded up and imprisoned. The very nature of their procession makes them easy targets. They're slow to buy too much, their distinctive robes, their predictable habit of seeking out town squares, all the things that made them such an effective spectacle now make them incredibly vulnerable. They have nowhere to hide. The psychology of the chase is complex. For some rulers, it's a matter of sincere piety. They believe they are doing God's work by stamping out a dangerous heresy. For others, it's pure political opportunism. The Flagellants had challenged their authority, stirred up their peasants, and threatened the stability of their lands. Crushing them is a way to reassert control, to remind everyone who is truly in charge. There's also a financial motive. The property of convicted heretics could be confiscated, and while most Flagellants were poor, their movement had collected significant donations, which now became a tempting prize for cash-strapped lords. A particularly strange and little-known aspect of this suppression is the role of public opinion. While the rulers were now united against them, the common people were divided. In some areas, where the Flagellants had caused riots of violence, the locals were happy to help the authorities hunt them down. They saw them as dangerous fanatics who had brought nothing but trouble. But in other places, where the memory of their passionate piety was still strong, some people tried to shelter them. A farmer might hide a few fleeing Flagellants in his barn, risking his own safety to protect the men he still considered holy. This created a kind of underground railroad for the fugitives, though it was a risky and oft unfutile endeavor. The Flagellants themselves are caught completely by surprise. They genuinely believed they were on a mission from God. They saw the Pope not as the vicar of Christ, but as a distant, corrupt politician who had lost touch with the true faith. They could not comprehend that the church they were trying to save was now actively trying to destroy them. Their reaction is one of defiant disbelief. Some bands fight back. When confronted by soldiers, they use their heavy wooden crosses and their scourges as makeshift weapons. It's a pathetic, hopeless resistance. Unarmed zealots, weakened by months of self-harm and starvation, are no match for trained men-at-arms. These skirmishes are brief, bloody, and always end the same way. For the young man from your town, this new reality must be a terrifying shock. The world has been turned completely upside down, once again. The path that he thought led to salvation now leads to a prison cell or the gallows. The brotherhood that gave him strength and purpose is now a scattered, hunted remnant. He is a fugitive. His daily life is no longer a rhythm of ritual and marching, but a desperate scramble for survival, hiding in forests and lonely farmsteads, always listening for the sound of approaching horses. The wave of suppression is brutally effective. Within a few months, the great marching processions that had terrorized and mesmerized Europe are a thing of the past. The movement is broken, scattered, but the fire of their belief is not so easily extinguished. Here and there, isolated, defiant bands of the faithful refuse to surrender or disperse. They continue their pilgrimage, now not just as an act of penance, but as an act of open rebellion against the authority of the church and state. You hear a story, one of the last of its kind, about one such group. It's a small band, perhaps only a dozen or so of the most committed zealots, led by a master whose conviction has hardened into a diamond-sharp point of defiance. They know they are being hunted. They know the Pope has condemned them, and that the local lord has a warrant for their arrest. Yet, they decide to perform their ritual one last time in public. It happens in a small, out-of-the-way town, a place they hope the authorities will be slow to reach. They march into the square at dusk, their movements now furtive and quick, not with the slow, solemn pace of their glory days. The few townsfolk who are out in the streets stare at them as if they are ghosts. The joyous bells and welcoming crowds are a distant memory. There is only a tense, fearful silence. The master does not give his usual long sermon. He speaks only a few, clipped sentences, his voice laced with a new and bitter fury. He declares that the Pope is the Antichrist, that the priests are the servants of Satan, and that they, the last true believers, are the only ones left fighting for God. Then they form their circle. It's a small, pathetic circle compared to the grand processions of the past. But they perform the ritual with a frenzied intensity that borders on the suicidal. The sound of the whips is not just a plea for God's mercy anymore. It is a sound of rage, of despair, of utter defiance. They are no longer just flogging themselves for the sins of mankind. They are flogging themselves in protest against a world, a church, and a God that have, in their eyes, utterly betrayed them. You can imagine the scene. The torchlight glinting off the metal studs of their scourges. The wild, desperate look in their eyes. This is not the controlled, theatrical performance of before. This is something raw, unhinged. This is the last, desperate roar of a dying movement. Of course, it doesn't last long. The local reeve, alerted to their presence, has gathered a small posse of guards and able-bodied men. They surround the square. There are no negotiations. There are no warnings. At the reeve signal, they rush in. The Flagellants are so lost in their ecstatic, violent trance that they barely have time to react. The fight, if you can call it that, is over in moments. A few of the brothers try to resist and are cut down. The rest, including the master, are clubbed into submission, disarmed, and bound with ropes. They are dragged from the square, leaving behind only the spatters of their blood on the cobblestones under profound, ringing silence. This scene, or variations of it, plays out in a handful of towns across the land. These last public processions are a subject of some historical curiosity. Why did they do it? Did they honestly believe they could reignite the movement? Or was it a form of collective martyrdom, a conscious choice to go down fighting, to make one last public statement of their faith? The academic world is divided, with some seeing it as a final, desperate strategic gamble, and others interpreting it as a purely expressive, almost suicidal act of faith. For you, hearing this story is like listening to the final, fading echo of a great storm. The thunder and lightning that once shook the foundations of your world have passed. All that is left are these few, scattered, and ultimately futile flashes on the horizon. The great, bloody pilgrimage of the Brothers of the Cross is ending not with a miracle, but with the grim, mundane reality of arrests and executions. The capture of the last flagella in Thebans marks the end of their public spectacle, but it is the beginning of a final, colder chapter in their story. The survivors are not simply released. They are heretics, and the machinery of the Inquisition, the Church's legal arm for dealing with such matters, grinds slowly but exceedingly fine. You hear about the trial of a captured flagella NT master. It's not a public spectacle like their rituals. It takes place in the somber, stone-walled chamber of a bishop's court. The master, who once commanded hundreds of followers with his voice, now stands alone, chained before a panel of grim-faced clergymen. He is no longer a prophet, he is a defendant. The chief inquisitor, a learned Dominican friar, does not engage in a battle of rhetoric. He engages in a surgical dissection of the master's beliefs. The questions are calm, precise, and designed like a trap. Did you claim that your pilgrimage was sanctioned by a letter delivered by an angel? The inquisitor might ask. If the master says yes, he is admitting to a false revelation. If he says no, he is a liar. Did you, a layman, hear the confessions of your followers and grant them absolution from their sins? This is the crucial question. To say yes is to admit to the gravest usurpation of priestly authority. There is no right answer. Did you preach that the authority of the Pope was corrupt and that your own authority came directly from God? The trial becomes a stark illustration of the fundamental conflict between two types of faith. On one side is the master. His faith is charismatic, emotional, and based on what he believes to be direct, personal experience of the divine. He saw the plague, he felt the despair, and he believes with every fiber of his being that called him to this brutal mission. He speaks of visions, of the ecstasy of the lush, of the urgent need for a penance as great as the sin. On the other side is the inquisitor. His faith is institutional, intellectual, and based on centuries of established doctrine and canon law. For him, Faith is not about personal feeling, it is about adherence to the one true creed as defined by the Church. He dismisses the Master's visions as demonic delusions. He sees the ecstasy of the lash not as piety, but as prideful, morbid exhibitionist. He methodically quotes scripture and the writings of the Church Fathers, demonstrating how every single one of the Flagellants' beliefs deviates from established orthodoxy. One of the most fascinating points of contention, often recorded in trial transcripts from the era, revolves around the scourges themselves. The inquisitor might demand to know why they used scourges with metal points, a practice specifically forbidden in many monastic orders as being excessively harmful. The Master's defense, that the times required a more extreme penance, is dismissed as theological arrogance. Who is he, a layman, to decide what level of penance is appropriate? The outcome of the trial is, of course, a foregone conclusion. The purpose is not to determine guilt or innocence in a modern sense, but to extract a confession and a recantation. The Master is likely subjected to questioning in the dungeons, the grim euphemism for torture. Under such duress, many would confess to anything. The final scene of the trial is the sentencing. The Master, broken in body and perhaps in spirit, is brought before the court one last time. He is offered a choice: he can publicly recant all of his beliefs, confess his heresy, and throw himself on the mercy of the Church, in which case he might be sentenced to life in a monastic prison, or he can hold fast to his faith, in which case he will be declared an obstinate heretic, relaxed to the secular authorities, and burned at the stake. You hear that this particular Master refused to recant. He went to the flames still proclaiming his divine mission. For the Church, it is the necessary and righteous removal of a cancerous growth. For the few secret sympathizers left in the crowd, he is a martyr for the true faith. The trial and execution serve their purpose. They are a stark, terrifying warning to anyone else who might dare to challenge the authority of the Church. The age of the bloody pilgrims is over, and the age of institutional order is being restored, one execution at a time. With the public processions crushed and the leaders executed or imprisoned, the great Flagellants movement of 1349 seems to vanish as quickly as it appeared. The dark marching columns that have been a fixture of the European landscape for the better part of a year are gone. The world, it seems, has returned to a grim, but recognizable form of order. But an idea, especially one born from such profound trauma and fervent belief, doesn't simply die. It goes underground. The Flagellants movement, though broken as a mass phenomenon, splinters into 100 scattered secret cells. It transforms from a public spectacle into a clandestine faith. You begin to hear whispers, not loud stories from travelers, but hushed, fearful rumors shared in the quiet of a tavern or over a fence. Rumors of small groups of men meeting in secret, deep in the woods or in the cellars of sympathizers, to continue their rituals. They no longer march from town to town. They are a static, hidden cult. Their practice is now shrouded in the secrecy that their persecution demands. Without the discipline of the great processions and the authority of the original masters, these splinter groups begin to evolve in strange and unpredictable ways. The theology becomes more radical, more explicitly anti-papal. If the Pope condemned them, then the Pope must be the Antichrist. This becomes a central tenet of their new, underground creed. They start to develop their own secret texts, their own prophecies, predicting the imminent downfall of the false Church of Avignon and the rise of a new age of the Holy Spirit, which they, the true penitents, will usher in. Historians refer to these later groups as the crypto-Flagellants. They are a fascinating and murky subject, as most of what we know about them comes from the Inquisition records that document their eventual discovery and destruction. These records paint a picture of small, intensely paranoid communities, bound together by their shared persecution and their radical beliefs. The rituals also change. The public scourging in the town square is no longer possible. Instead, they practice their penance in private, their hymns sung in hushed tones, their cries of pain muffled by the cellar walls. The act, once a public appeal for God's mercy upon the world, becomes an intensely private, almost mystical rite of the initiated few. One of the more bizarre developments is how they begin to incorporate other folk beliefs and heretical ideas into their own. In some regions, Flagellants beliefs merge with local prophecies or mystical traditions, creating strange hybrid faiths. They become a magnet for all forms of dissent against the church. If you had a grievance with your local priest or a bone to pick with a bishop, the secret Flagellants conventicle might be the only place you could find a sympathetic ear. These secret societies managed to survive for a surprisingly long time. For decades, even into the early 15th century, the church was still finding and prosecuting pockets of Flagellants believers. They became a persistent, low-level infection in the body of Christendom, a constant reminder of the chaos of the plague years. You might even see signs of their continued, hidden presence in your own community. You might notice a small group of men who are a little too somber, who meet a little too regularly at one man's house, who seem to share a secret that sets them apart from everyone else. You might see a strange symbol, a stylized scourge, crudely carved on a tree in the woods. These are the ghosts of the great movement. They are the embers of the wildfire, glowing in the dark, long after the main blaze has been extinguished. They are a testament to the fact that you can kill the prophets, you can outlaw the ritual, but you cannot easily kill the desperate hope and the profound anger that gave birth to the movement in the first place. The landscape is quiet again, but the silence is filled with secrets. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world around you begins to change. The constant, dreadful tolling of the church bell for the dead becomes less frequent. One morning, you wake up and realize you haven't heard the rumble of the death cart in 3 days. You see a neighbor you had assumed was dead working in his small garden, his face gaunt but his eyes clear of the plague fever. The great pestilence, the Black Death, is finally receding. It doesn't end in a single, victorious moment. It simply fades. Like a terrible tide, it pours back, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage and grief. But also, for the first time in what feels like a lifetime, a fragile, tentative silence. As the immediate fear of death begins to lift, a new kind of reckoning begins. You and your surviving neighbors start to take stock of the world that is left. The empty houses stand like open mouths, their silence a testament to the families that are gone. Entire bloodlines have been wiped out. The town is emptier, quieter. There are not enough hands to till the fields, not enough artisans to run the workshops. The very structure of your society has been hollowed out. And in this new, emptier world, people begin to look back and try to make sense of what just happened. The memory of the Flagellants, who had burned so brightly and so briefly in the heart of the chaos, is now a subject of confused and often bitter reflection. What did it all mean? You hear the question debated in hushed tones. Some people, those who once welcomed the Flagellants as saviors, now speak of them with a kind of shame. Their desperate welcome seems like a foolish, hysterical mistake in the cold light of day. The church, reasserting its authority, preaches that the Flagellants were a wicked heresy and that the plague finally ended not because of their bloody rituals, but because of the true faithful. This becomes the official narrative, the story that history is supposed to remember. But others are not so sure. A farmer, whose family was miraculously spared while his neighbors on either side perished, might quietly wonder, was it just luck? Or did the sacrifice of those strange, bloody pilgrims who perform their ritual in his town square actually do something? Did their pain somehow shield him? It's a thought you would never dare speak aloud, not with the priest listening, but the question lingers. This is a debate that, in a way, has never truly ended, even among modern historians. On a purely scientific level, of course, the Flagellants' actions had no effect on the course of a bacterial pandemic. If anything, their travels and unhygienic practices likely helped spread the disease. But history is not just about scientific facts, it's about what people believed. Did the Flagellants movement have a positive psychological effect on a traumatized populace? A tangible course of action in a helpless situation? Did they give some people the will to survive? Or was their message of apocalyptic doom and their incitement to violence just another layer of destructive horror piled on top of the plague itself? There is no easy answer. You see the legacy of the plague in strange, unexpected ways. With so many dead, labor is suddenly in short supply. For the first time, peasants like you have a degree of power. You can demand higher wages, better conditions. The old feudal bonds are weakened. The world has been shaken. And in the aftermath, the social order is being rebuilt on slightly different foundations. Some historians argue that the Black Death, in its brutal way, was the death knell of the old medieval order and the catalyst for the economic and social changes that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. You think of the young man from your town, the cooper's son who joined their procession. You never heard what happened to him. Did he die of the winter cold? Was he cut down by a knight's sword? Was he captured, tried, and executed? Or did he, by some miracle, survive? You sometimes imagine him, an old man, living in some distant village, the scars on his back a secret map of a time when the world went mad. And he went mad with it, marching in a desperate, bloody prayer for a salvation that never quite came in the way he expected. The plague is over, but its ghosts, and the ghosts of the Flagellants, will haunt the memory of Europe for centuries to come. The years that follow are quiet. The silence that returns is different from the silence of the plague. That was a heavy, breathless silence, thick with fear. This new silence is thin, hollowed out, echoing with all that has been lost. The world has been scoured clean, and in the empty spaces, a new kind of life begins to grow. You are older now. You see the world through the eyes of a survivor. The simple and questioning faith you had as a youth is gone forever, replaced by something harder, more complex. You still go to church, you still listen to the priest, but the words land differently. You have seen what lies beneath the surface of the world, the chaos that can erupt when the familiar order breaks down. You have seen it in the ecstatic, bloody faces of the Flagellants, and you are not sure which one was more terrifying. The scars are everywhere, if you know where to look. They are in the fields that have been reclaimed by weeds because there are not enough hands to farm them. They are in the faces of the children who grew up without parents, a generation of orphans who inherited a world they were not prepared for. Society has been reshaped by absence. Young men become masters of their guilds decades before they should have. Young women inherit property and run businesses, not out of any social revolution, but because their fathers and husbands are gone. It is a world run by the young, by the survivors, and it is a world filled with ghosts. The memory of the plague and the Flagellants seeps into art, into culture. New, morbid paintings begin to appear on church walls. It is the dance macabre, the dance of death. Skeletons are shown leading popes, kings, knights, and peasants alike in a grim procession to the grave. The message is clear: death is the great equalizer. It comes for everyone. And sometimes, in the background of these paintings, you can see figures whipping themselves. A permanent, haunting reminder of the extreme measures people took to try and bargain with the inevitable. And what of the Flagellants' core idea? The idea that ordinary people, without the help of priests, could forge their own path to God. This is the most profound and debated scar of all. The Church would say the idea was a heresy that was successfully destroyed. But was it? Historians will forever wonder if the movement, in its spectacular failure, planted a seed of doubt. A seed of anti-clericalism and lay piety that would lie dormant for a time, only to sprout again, more than a century later, in the fertile ground of the Reformation. Did the Flagellants' desperate, bloody march inadvertently help clear a path for men like Martin Luther? It is a question that hangs in the quiet air of the new century. Sometimes, on a cold winter evening when the wind howls outside, you find your mind drifting back to that day in the square. You can almost hear the rhythmic chanting, the sickening slap of the scourges. It feels like a fever dream, a story someone else told you. It's hard to believe it was real, that your quiet, predictable world once played host to such a strange and terrible passion. The silence has returned. Yes, but it is not the silence of innocence. It is the silence of a scar, a quiet, permanent reminder of the wound beneath. And so the story of the bloody pilgrims and the world they tried to save comes to its end. The last chant has faded, the final footstep on that long and painful road has fallen. The memory of it all can begin to soften now, the sharp edges of the story blurring and dissolving, like ink washing away in a gentle rain. The past can finally be left in the past. There is nothing more to examine, nothing left to understand. All that remains is this quiet moment, here in the comfort of your own space. You can feel the story receding, becoming distant, a faint echo in a world that is growing heavy and soft around you. The weight of your body is a pleasant, grounding feeling. The support beneath you is solid and real. You can let go of the images, let go of the images, let go of the sounds. Let the silence of your room be your companion now, a silence that is peaceful and deep. Each breath you take can carry you a little further away from the tale that was told, and a little closer to the quiet threshold of your own dreams. The path of our story concludes here. If you need to walk a little tonight, you know where to find other gentle trails. Rest well. Good night.